There is a photograph of Carolyn Jones taken on her wedding day in September 1982. She is smiling. She is wearing a lace cap to cover the hair she had lost to chemotherapy. She had been told, not long before, that the cancer inside her was terminal. She married anyway, because that is the kind of woman she was. Someone who refused to stop reaching for the things she wanted, right up until the moment she couldn't reach anymore. Most people remember her as Morticia Adams. Pale skin, dark eyes, that slow, gliding walk across a black and white set. But behind the character, there was a real woman with a real life. One that was far stranger, far more painful, and far more fascinating than anything she ever played on screen. 4 marriages, a career that soared and crashed and soared again, and an ending that even now is hard to sit with. This is her story. The Girl from Amarillo. Carolyn Sue Jones was born on April 28, 1930, in Amarillo, Texas. Her father was Julius Alfred Jones, a barber. Her mother was Chloe Jeanette Southern, a housewife. By 1934, when Carolyn was just 4 years old, Julius had walked out on the family, leaving Chloe to raise Carolyn and her younger sister Bet alone. They moved in with Carolyn's maternal grandparents, and that house in Amarillo, with its tight finances and its missing father, was where she grew up. She had severe asthma as a child, the kind that kept her indoors when other children were outside, the kind that came with restrictions and limitations that a young girl with an overactive imagination and a desperate need for something more than what she had would find particularly hard to bear. When she couldn't go to the movies, and often she couldn't, she read Hollywood fan magazines instead, every issue, cover to cover. She memorized the names of the studios, the directors, the cinematographers. She studied the gossip columns the way other children studied geography. She built, in the cramped reality of a household without a father and without much money, an interior world that was enormous and cinematic and pointed entirely toward California. Years later, in an interview in 1961, she described her childhood directly, that her health had prevented her from going to school, that she was not well enough to play outside, that her activity was mental rather than physical. She said it matter-of-factly, as someone who had long since turned that limitation into something useful. The time spent indoors reading about Hollywood was the time she spent deciding what her life was going to look like. From a very early age, she told anyone who would listen that she was going to become an actress. Not as a vague childhood dream, but as a specific, fixed intention. She attended Amarillo High School, where she studied elocution and won first place in the Tri-State Declamation Contest in her junior year. She was not just pretty. She was sharp, driven, and better on her feet in front of an audience than most adults twice her age. The performing had always come naturally, the storytelling, the instinct for holding a room. What she needed was the formal training to turn that instinct into craft. After graduating in 1947, she went to her grandfather and told him she wanted to enroll at the Pasadena Playhouse in California, one of the most respected acting schools in the country, a place that had already produced a string of Hollywood names. Her grandfather, Charles Baker, was not immediately enthusiastic. He had other ideas about what a suitable career looked like. The story goes that Carolyn sat on the steps of Southern Methodist University, which he had taken her to visit, and wept and pleaded until he changed his mind. He paid her tuition. She enrolled at 17. She may have lied about her age to get in. The minimum age was reportedly 18, and various accounts conflict on whether she was 15, 17, or had simply claimed to be older than she was. Whatever the truth of it, she got through the door, and once she was inside, she threw herself at the work with an intensity that impressed her teachers and fellow students alike. She performed in summer stock productions for extra experience. She took every role she could get. And it was during these years at the Pasadena Playhouse that the first of her 4 marriages began. The first marriage, Don Donaldson. His name was Don Donaldson. He was a former United States Army Air Corps officer from Detroit, Michigan, older than Carolyn by about 8 years, and he was studying at the Pasadena Playhouse at the same time she was. Whether he was pursuing acting seriously or simply filling time after the military is not entirely clear. What is clear is that he and Carolyn fell quickly and hard for each other. They married in Las Vegas on June 20th, 1949. Records show the ceremony there, followed by a second ceremony in Los Angeles on August 19th, 1950, suggesting some complexity around the legality or circumstances of the first. Carolyn was 19, Don was 26. The age gap was not insignificant, and the whirlwind nature of the relationship, meeting at school, marrying within months, would have raised eyebrows even in an era when young marriages were more common. It did not last. The precise reasons are not something Carolyn ever discussed at length in public. What is known is that the marriage ended in divorce before she had properly launched her film career. Some accounts describe it as a brief, impulsive union between 2 people who were better suited as passing ships than as permanent partners. The age gap, Don was 8 years older, and the impulsiveness of the timeline, from first meeting to wedding in under a year, suggests 2 people who moved on feeling rather than on anything more durable. Others point to the accelerating pace of Carolyn's ambition as the real force that pulled her away from anything that wasn't pointed directly toward Hollywood. What is worth noting is how quickly she moved on from it. Not callously. She was not a callous person, but with the kind of forward momentum that characterized everything she did. The divorce happened. It hurt whatever it hurt. And then she put her head down and worked. She would repeat this pattern throughout her life, absorb the loss, return to the craft, keep moving. Because by the early 1950s, her career was beginning to move in ways that made the failed marriage feel like a footnote. A talent scout spotted her at the Pasadena Playhouse in a production of Dark of the Moon and connected her to Paramount Pictures. She was signed. Her first film appearance came in 1952's The Turning Point, a small, uncredited role, but a foot in the door. Then came The Big Heat in 1953, another uncredited part as a nightclub hostess. Then House of Wax in 1953, in which she played the woman that Vincent Price's character turns into a wax statue of Joan of Arc. It was the kind of role that got noticed. Darkly memorable, visually arresting, the kind of thing that stayed with audiences. The marriage to Don Donaldson was over before any of this happened. She filed it away and moved forward. That was, in many ways, Carolyn's defining quality. She did not stop moving, but the patterns that had already begun to establish themselves in that first marriage, the speed, the passion, the faith that this time would be different, would repeat themselves 3 more times. And the second marriage would be the one that defined her career almost as much as the role she was still years away from playing. The second marriage, Aaron Spelling. In the early 1950s, Aaron Spelling was nobody. That is not unkind. It is simply what the record shows. He was a young man from Dallas, Texas, with a degree from Southern Methodist University and a Tony Award equivalent prize for playwriting. But in Hollywood, he was barely treading water. He had played small roles here and there, written a little, struggled a lot. When he and Carolyn met, he was earning around $100 a month directing a show for Preston Sturges. Carolyn was working backstage at a theatre called the Players' Ring, essentially for nothing. They married on April 5th, 1953, she converted to Judaism as part of the union. They were, by most accounts, genuinely in love, a couple of broke, ambitious young people in Hollywood who pooled their energy and their dreams and tried to make something out of both. For the first several years, Carolyn was the one holding the financial reality of their marriage together. Her film career was moving faster than his. She took roles she didn't particularly want, in productions that were beneath her, because the work paid and they needed the money. Aaron acknowledged this explicitly in later years, that she had worked jobs that were, in his word, trash, so that he could stay home and write. Her career in this period was genuinely impressive in ways that the Morticia shadow has somewhat obscured. In 1953, she was cast in From Here to Eternity, one of the most anticipated films of the year, a film that would go on to win 8 Academy Awards, in the role of Alma Burke. She contracted pneumonia and had to withdraw. The role went to Donna Reed, who won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress for it. The near miss is one of those Hollywood footnotes that is genuinely painful to contemplate. A serious illness at exactly the wrong moment, costing her a role that might have defined a decade. But other things came. In 1956, she appeared in Invasion of the Body Snatchers, the science fiction film that would become a landmark of the genre, and in Alfred Hitchcock's The Man Who Knew Too Much, alongside James Stewart and Doris Day. Hitchcock was then at the height of his powers, and working for him meant something. In 1957, she appeared in The Bachelor Party, directed by Delbert Mann. She was on screen for 8 minutes out of a feature-length film, and she received a nomination for the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress. The performance was described by critics at the time as a knockout, a woman who lives entirely in the margins of the story, but who, in those few minutes, makes the film's emotional center suddenly visible. The nomination was not a polite gesture. It was recognition from the film industry's own body that what she had done in those 8 minutes was among the finest supporting performances of the year. She did not win the Oscar. Miyoshi Umeki took it home for Sayonara that year, but the nomination confirmed something that people in the industry had been noticing for a while. Carolyn Jones could do things with small amounts of screen time that most actors couldn't do with 50 minutes. She had a quality that the camera found and held onto. That same year, 1958, she appeared alongside Elvis Presley in King Creole, widely regarded as the best film Presley ever made. She was cast as a nightclub singer with a complicated relationship to the story's central characters, and her scenes with Presley had a genuine charge to them. 2 performers who understood each other's energy and used it. She won the Golden Globe Award for New Star of the Year for her role in Marjorie Morningstar, sharing the honor with Sandra Dee and Diane Varsi. In 1959, she worked with Frank Sinatra in A Hole in the Head, with Dean Martin in Career, and with Anthony Quinn and Kirk Douglas in Last Train from Gun Hill. Those are not small names in a small industry. For a brief, shining window, Carolyn Jones looked like she was going to be one of the defining film actresses of her generation. The Oscar nomination, the Golden Globe, the string of major productions. It was the kind of trajectory that suggested the best was still ahead. And it was during this window, as her star was genuinely rising and her name was one that opened doors, that something began to go wrong in the marriage. Aaron's career shifted. He moved from acting to writing and then to producing. In 1956, he sold his first script to The Jane Wyman Show. Then came more writing, more producing, more of the strategic, behind-the-camera work at which he was, it turned out, extraordinarily gifted. The show that gave him his first significant break as a producer was The Dick Powell Show in the early 1960s. Aaron Spelling's trajectory from that point forward only went up. Carolyn's trajectory had begun to flatten. The enormous momentum of the late 1950s had not translated into the film career she had envisioned. Parts were good, but not great. The studio system that had once supported her was changing. And at home, the balance of the marriage had shifted. The man she had once been supporting was now the one on his way to becoming a television dynasty. In October 1963, they separated. By all accounts, it was not a dramatic rupture. The language used in the press at the time and in later interviews was the familiar language of mutual affection that had outlasted romantic compatibility. They still loved each other, but could not live together. Aaron had reportedly developed a habit of staying out late without explanation in the final period of the marriage, and the accumulation of small distances had simply become too wide to bridge. The imbalance that had crept into the marriage was also real and not easy to navigate. For most of their 11 years together, Carolyn had been the one who made the money. She had been the working actress, while he had been the struggling writer. Now he was the one ascending, and she was the one who had plateaued. That kind of reversal is hard on any relationship. It introduces questions about who you are to each other and what the partnership means when the terms have shifted so fundamentally. The divorce was finalized in August 1964. Carolyn did not ask for alimony. She had that particular kind of pride, the kind that would rather struggle than accept money from a situation she was choosing to leave. Aaron gave her their house as part of the settlement, and the community property, around $400,000, was divided between them. By the standards of Hollywood divorce, it was remarkably clean. They issued the kind of statement that says nothing and means something. They remain friends. There is no animosity. They simply could not make the marriage work. They remained friends, genuinely. In the 1970s, when Carolyn was working her way back into a career that had gone cold, she guest starred on several shows produced by the man who was now one of the most powerful television producers in America, including Fantasy Island and The Love Boat, two of the most watched programs of the decade. He helped her when he could. She thanked him by showing up and being good at her job. But in August 1964, standing on the other side of that divorce, Carolyn was 34 years old. Her biggest role was about to begin, and it was about to trap her in ways she couldn't see coming. Morticia and the Trap. The same year her marriage to Aaron Spelling ended, Carolyn Jones was offered the role of Morticia Addams in a new television series called The Addams Family, based on the cartoons of Charles Addams that had been running in The New Yorker since the 1930s. Aaron Spelling, characteristically, was the one who talked her into taking it. Carolyn had always considered herself a film actress. Television was something she had resisted. She had turned down television offers in the past because the medium felt like a step down from the cinema career she had spent years building. But the role of Morticia was not a small part in a forgettable series. It was the lead. It was a character with genuine comic and dramatic range. It was something different. She took it, and she was extraordinary. The Morticia she created was not simply a spooky woman in a black dress. She was unhurried, elegant, completely unaware that the world found her family disturbing, and deeply, sincerely in love with her husband Gomez in a way that was both funny and genuinely warm. She moved in that tight costume, a $500 custom-made dress so narrow that her weight could not fluctuate during the series, with a deliberate minimal movement that became a kind of signature. She wore a long black wig. She dyed her eyebrows. The character required her to be still in the way that only very confident performers can be still. The series ran from September 1964 to April 1966. 64 episodes in 2 seasons. It was a success. popular with audiences, a genuine cultural phenomenon, and durable in a way that none of its creators fully predicted. Carolyn received a Golden Globe nomination for her performance. She was, within the specific universe of that show, perfect. The show went head-to-head in its time slot with two other new series, The Munsters on CBS and Bewitched on ABC. All three found audiences. The Addams Family held its own. Cast and crew remembered the production as a warm one. The cast genuinely liked each other, the material was good, and the weekly grind of network television had not yet worn the novelty down. Carolyn, for her part, had moved into that role and made it entirely her own in a way that the cartoonist Charles Addams, whose drawings had inspired the series, had personally hoped for. He had chosen her. And then the network cancelled it. Not because the ratings had collapsed. The ratings were solid. But ABC decided the time slot and the format were better used elsewhere. And the show that had made Carolyn Jones one of the most recognizable faces on American television ended before she had earned enough from it to give her the financial cushion that a few more years would have provided. She later reflected, with characteristic honesty, that she had expected the typecast risk to be manageable because people remembered her film career. She had been wrong. The word for what happened next is typecasting, and it is one of the crueler things the entertainment industry does to performers. Studios and producers looked at Carolyn Jones and saw Morticia Addams. The pale skin, the dark eyes, the macabre, slow walk. They had difficulty seeing past it to the woman who had been nominated for an Academy Award, who had acted alongside Elvis Presley and Frank Sinatra, who had held her own against Kirk Douglas and Anthony Quinn and Dean Martin. The Addams Family had been, professionally, the greatest double-edged sword she ever picked up. The late 1960s were lean years. Parts were infrequent and often not worth having. She did theatre work. She took anything that let her keep working, because stopping entirely felt, to Carolyn Jones, worse than accepting less than she deserved. And it was during this lean stretch, working on the road, that the third chapter of her romantic life began. The third marriage, Herbert Green. Herbert Green was, by the time he and Carolyn met, one of the most respected musical directors in Broadway history. He had conducted The Music Man, one of the defining Broadway productions of the late 1950s, starring Robert Preston, a show that ran for over 1,000 performances and shaped what people expected a Broadway musical to sound like. He had also worked on The Unsinkable Molly Brown and Guys and Dolls and several other major productions. He had won a Tony Award. As a vocal coach, he had worked with some of the biggest names in both theatre and film: Rosalind Russell, Angela Lansbury, Barbara Cook, Henry Fonda, Rock Hudson, and dozens of others who had come to him, usually when they were making the transition from film to stage and needed to develop the vocal range and projection that a live theatre demanded. He was, in other words, exactly the kind of serious, accomplished professional that Carolyn Jones had always been drawn to. Someone who knew what they were doing, who had built something real in their field, and who moved through the performing world with genuine authority. He had been married twice before. His first marriage, to his childhood sweetheart, a pianist named Lucy Green, had lasted 13 years before ending in divorce in 1959. They had 2 children together, a daughter named Deborah and a son named Joshua. His second marriage was to a woman named Norma Geist. That too had ended. By 1968, Herbert was single, had relocated from New York City to Los Angeles, and was beginning to make the transition toward film and television work. He and Carolyn crossed paths in the theatre world she had been working in during the lean post-Addams years, and what began as a professional connection, he was her vocal coach, became something more. He and Carolyn married on December 19th, 1968, in Beverly Hills, California. The ceremony was held at the home of a family friend, Rabbi Edgar Magnin, officiating. It was Carolyn's third marriage, and Herbert's third as well. Two people who had both been around the circuit before, who presumably knew something about what hadn't worked, and were trying this time to get it right. They moved to Palm Springs, away from the noise of Los Angeles, away from the industry, away from the constant reminder of who she had been and what the industry now thought of her. Herbert had his own professional life, still connected to music and to television through consultancy and vocal coaching work. The early years of the marriage appear, from the outside, to have been relatively settled, a quieter chapter after the upheavals of the preceding decade. There was something both restful and slightly uncomfortable about that quiet for Carolyn. She had never been someone who was at ease with stillness. The childhood asthma that had confined her to her room in Amarillo had bred in her a specific kind of restlessness, a need to be reaching for something, working towards something, moving through the world rather than standing still in it. Palm Springs was beautiful. Herbert was accomplished and interesting. The life they had built together was a good one, by most reasonable measures. But the pull of Hollywood was something she could not permanently resist. She had spent her entire adult life working toward a career in the entertainment industry, and the idea of stepping away from it permanently, even to a comfortable life in Palm Springs with a successful, intelligent husband, was not something that sat easily with her. She missed the work. She missed the camera. She missed the particular electricity of being in front of an audience and doing what she had been training herself to do since she was a teenager in Texas. The 1970s offered unexpected opportunities. In 1976, she appeared in the horror film Eaten Alive, directed by Tobe Hooper, who would go on to significant notoriety in the genre. Also in 1976, she appeared in Wonder Woman as Hippolyta, the mother of the title character played by Linda Carter, a small but visible role on one of the most watched shows of the season. She appeared in Roots in 1977, the landmark television miniseries that became one of the most watched broadcasts in American history, playing Mrs. Moore, the wife of a plantation owner. It was a serious piece of American television, and her presence in it was a reminder that she could handle dramatic material of real weight. She did 4 episodes of Fantasy Island and an episode of The Love Boat, both shows produced in one of those Hollywood circles within circles by Aaron Spelling. 2 of her 4 husbands were producing her work in the same decade. She never made anything of that particular irony publicly, but it is the kind of detail that says something about how small and interconnected the world she lived in really was. On April 5th, 1977, Carolyn filed for divorce from Herbert Green. She was moving back to Hollywood, back to the career that had never fully let go of her. The marriage had lasted 9 years. The divorce was finalized, and by all accounts the separation was relatively undramatic. 2 people who had grown in different directions, slowly rather than suddenly. She was 46 years old, divorced 3 times, back in Los Angeles. And something was already growing inside her that she would not discover, or at least not acknowledge, for several more years. But first, one more love story, and this one, the final one, was going to look different from all the others. The 4th marriage, Peter Bailey Britton. By the late 1970s, Carolyn Jones had been in Hollywood for 3 decades. She had been famous, and then less famous, and then famous again in a different way. She had been married 3 times, and was living alone in Los Angeles, with, by her own account, no particular intention of marrying again. 3 marriages and 3 divorces tended to recalibrate a person's sense of what marriage was for, and whether they needed more of it. Peter Bailey Britton was an actor. younger than Carolyn, less prominent, working in the industry at a level significantly below hers. They met and fell into a relationship that lasted, as friends and companions and eventually partners, for approximately 5 years before they married. The relationship was, by all reports, a warm one, not the electric, career-driven dynamism of the Spelling years, nor the theatrical world of Herbert Green's Broadway connections, but something quieter and more companionable. He was present in the way that several of the previous marriages, for various reasons, had not always managed to be. In 1981, Carolyn was cast as Myrna Clegg in the CBS daytime soap opera Capital. A power-hungry political matriarch, scheming and formidable, the kind of role that gave her room to do what she had always done well: be compelling in a confined space with a minimum of fuss. The show debuted in March 1982. It was a new beginning of sorts. A show with an audience, a character with genuine texture, a reason to be in front of the cameras every working day. And then, in March 1981, she had been diagnosed with colon cancer. The diagnosis had come while she was still preparing for Capital, while the show was still in pre-production. She processed it in the way she processed everything: alone first, quietly, and then by deciding how she was going to handle it in front of other people. The decision she made was to tell no one on the set. She told her colleagues she was being treated for ulcers. She continued to show up. She hit her marks. She delivered her lines. She was, according to the people who worked alongside her on Capital, completely professional. The kind of actress who left her private life in the car park and arrived on set as someone else. There was a period in late 1981 and into 1982 of what appeared to be remission, the cancer responding to treatment, the numbers moving in the right direction, a cautious easing of the worst fears. And then, in 1982, the cancer returned. This time the doctors were clear. It had spread to her liver and her stomach. It was not going to be managed. It was terminal. At that point, Carolyn Jones made two decisions. The first was to keep working. She would continue to play Myrna Clegg for as long as she physically could, and she did, getting into a wheelchair when she could no longer stand, having her scenes written or repositioned to accommodate her deteriorating mobility, staying on the show until she literally could not continue anymore. The production accommodated her as best it could. Her castmates knew by then that what they were watching was not just a professional at work, but a person choosing the stage over the alternative. The second decision was to marry Peter Bailey Britton. On September 25th, 1982, they were married. She wore a lace and ribbon cap to cover the hair she had lost during chemotherapy. She knew she was dying. He knew she was dying. They got married anyway, because after 5 years together, the time for waiting had run out. The ceremony was private. There was no press announcement, no magazine photo spread, no carefully worded statement about the romance. Just two people making a commitment in the time that was left. She had maintained the fiction of the ulcers with a tenacity that her colleagues later described as both astonishing and heartbreaking. She had not wanted to be looked at differently. She had not wanted the machinery of public sympathy to start running around her while she was still trying to work. She had wanted to be seen as Carolyn Jones, actress, for as long as she possibly could. She finished the first season of Capital. She kept working through the pain, in the wheelchair, in scenes that had to be lit and shot differently to hide what was happening to her body. For an audience of daytime television viewers who had no idea that the scheming Myrna Clegg was being played by a woman fighting for her life every single day she came onto that set. Her co-star, Jane Daly, described her after the fact with a specificity that has stayed in the record. She said Carolyn was determined to keep playing that character until she literally could not get the words out of her mouth anymore. Indomitable is the word she used. It is, by any measure, the right word. In July 1983, Carolyn Jones fell into a coma at her home in West Hollywood. She died on August 3rd, 1983. She was 53 years old. Her body was cremated the following day. A memorial service was held at Glasband Willen Mortuary in Altadena, California, on August 5th. She is buried at Melrose Abbey Memorial Park in Anaheim, alongside her mother, the woman who had raised her alone after her father left, the woman she had brought to Hollywood from Amarillo decades earlier, the woman she had been close to her entire life. She had told her sister Bet, in the final period, what she wanted her epitaph to say. She wanted it to say, "She gave joy to the world, the shape of a life, 4 marriages, no children, a choice she had made with Aaron Spelling, deciding that the demands of a career and a family were not something she could hold simultaneously, and a decision she had carried forward through everything that followed." She later said, when asked about it, that she had known from early in her career that the kind of actress she wanted to be required a particular kind of focus, and that she had chosen the focus. It was a choice, and she owned it, even in later years when the marriages had come and gone, and the career had not become the unbroken triumph she had imagined. An Academy Award nomination at the peak of her powers, a Golden Globe, a role that made her face known to millions and then, paradoxically, made it harder to be seen as anything else. A career that spanned more than 3 decades and included more than 30 films, dozens of television appearances, and characters that ranged from scheming soap opera matriarchs to the wife of a plantation owner to the mother of Wonder Woman. The 4 marriages tell their own story, each one a chapter in what was, beneath the public version, a very private life. Dawn Donaldson was a young woman's first attempt at love. Brief, impulsive, soon outgrown, the kind of beginning that many people have and few people talk about. Aaron Spelling was a partnership of equals that became unequal as his career found its true scale, and that ended with more grace than it perhaps had reason to. The 2 of them remaining friends, helping each other's careers, carrying no apparent bitterness across the years. Herbert Green was a retreat from the industry, a slower decade in Palm Springs, a gentler chapter that ultimately couldn't hold her because she was constitutionally incapable of staying away from the work she had been building toward since childhood. And Peter Bailey Britton was the final arrival, the person she chose, with full knowledge of how little time was left, to be with at the end. The cancer she fought in those final years was as relentless as everything else in her life had been difficult. She did not step away from the camera to rest. She did not use the terminal diagnosis as permission to stop. She showed up in a wheelchair on a daytime soap opera and played a scheming political matriarch while telling her colleagues she had ulcers, in a performance of ordinary professional normalcy that required as much skill and endurance as anything she ever did on screen. There is something in that last chapter that is almost too much to sit with comfortably. The secret illness maintained for months. The wedding in September 1982 with the lace cap covering the damage of chemotherapy. The wheelchair on the Capitol set. The scenes shot to accommodate a body that was failing, while the character kept scheming and plotting and being entirely alive. It is not a dignified, slow fade, or a graceful retirement into gratitude and remembrance. It is someone holding on with everything they have, right to the very last moment, to the life they chose. She had chosen it at 17, weeping on the steps of a university she did not want to attend, begging her grandfather to let her go to Pasadena and become what she had always known she was going to be. She had held on to it through 4 marriages and an Oscar nomination and a cancellation and typecasting and terminal illness and everything else the decades had been able to throw at her. Before she died, she told her sister Bet what she wanted her legacy to be. Not a filmography, not an award, not even a role. Just a simple statement. She gave joy to the world. In the end, she was exactly who she said she was going to be. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories. There is a moment in Singin' in the Rain, one of the most famous moments in the history of American film, where Gene Kelly walks out into a downpour and starts to dance. He swings around a lamppost, splashes through puddles, grins at strangers passing under their umbrellas. The whole sequence radiates a kind of impossible, uncomplicated joy. It is one of the great performances of exuberance ever put on film, and it was shot by a man running a fever of 103 degrees, dancing in a tank of water mixed with milk so it would show up better on camera, in a suit that had to be dried and re-soaked between takes. Gene Kelly spent his professional life making the extraordinary look effortless. His personal life was something else entirely. 3 marriages, each shaped by the particular pressures of who he was and the world he lived in, each carrying its own weight of ambition, longing, and loss. The dancing in the rain was the performance. What follows is the rest of the story. The man before the marriages, Eugene Curran Kelly, was born on August 23, 1912, in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The third of 5 children in an Irish Catholic family that was working class in the most earnest sense of the phrase. His father, James Patrick Kelly, worked as a phonograph salesman. His mother, Harriet, was the organizing force of the household. A woman of considerable determination who had strong opinions about what her children should become and was not shy about expressing them. She enrolled young Gene in dancing school when he was 8 years old. He hated it. He was a boy in a working-class Pittsburgh neighborhood in the early 1920s, and dancing lessons were not exactly a badge of social status in that context. He endured years of being teased for it, and he responded to the teasing the way he responded to most opposition throughout his life, by getting better, by working harder, by turning what was being used against him into something nobody could argue with. By his early teens, he had stopped hating dancing. He had started loving it in the way that people love things they discover they are genuinely, extraordinarily good at. He and his brother Fred performed together at local events, at clubs, at any venue that would have them. He was earning money from performing before he was old enough to drive. He attended Pennsylvania State University, began studying economics, then transferred to the University of Pittsburgh. The Depression was happening around him, and the practical realities of his family's situation meant that earning money was not an abstract concern. He taught dance lessons, sometimes to as many as several hundred students, to help support the family during some of its toughest years. He opened a dance studio in Pittsburgh with his brother Fred. He was, in his early 20s, a working teacher as well as a developing performer. What drove him toward New York, and eventually toward Broadway and then Hollywood, was not simply ambition in the conventional sense. It was the specific hunger of someone who had identified exactly what they were built to do and who was not going to be satisfied doing anything else. He arrived in New York in the late 1930s, found work in the chorus of shows, moved up steadily, and landed the role that changed everything. Pal Joey in Rogers and Hart's musical of the same name, which opened on Broadway on December 25th, 1940. Pal Joey made him. The character was a heel, a charming, manipulative nightclub dancer who used the people around him for his own ends. It was not a sympathetic role, and it required Kelly to project a kind of charisma that worked even when the character's behavior was at its worst. He pulled it off completely. The reviews were extraordinary. Hollywood came calling almost immediately. He arrived in Los Angeles in 1941 under contract to David O. Selznick, who promptly loaned him to MGM. The deal led to For Me and My Gal in 1942, opposite Judy Garland. From there, the career built quickly. Cover Girl with Rita Hayworth in 1944. Anchors Away in 1945. Ziegfeld Follies in 1946. And then, as the decade closed, the string of films that established him permanently in the American cultural imagination. What Kelly brought to film that was genuinely new was a physical vocabulary that had not been seen before. Fred Astaire, the figure he was most often compared to, and with whom he shared the distinction of being one of the two greatest dancer performers in Hollywood history, worked in a mode that was elegant, refined, aristocratic. Kelly's mode was different. He was athletic, where Astaire was graceful, earthy, where Astaire was elevated. His movement came from the ground up, had weight to it, made you aware of the physical effort behind the apparent ease in a way that Astaire's did not. It was a different argument about what dancing could be, and audiences responded to it with enormous enthusiasm. He was also, from early in his Hollywood career, someone who thought seriously about what the movie musical could do as a form. He was not content to simply perform numbers that had been choreographed by others. He wanted control over the creative process, wanted to design the movement, wanted the dance sequences to advance the story rather than simply interrupt it. He fought for this control and, as his stature grew, increasingly obtained it. But by the time he arrived in Hollywood, he had already met the woman he would marry first. And that marriage, the one that lasted the longest and cost the most, in the end, had already begun to take shape. Marriage. 1. Betsy Blair. Betsy Blair was 18 years old when she met Gene Kelly. He was 26. The year was 1940, just before Pal Joey opened, and she was a teenager who had been dancing at a New York nightclub called Diamond Horseshoe. Not as a headliner, but as a member of the chorus line, young and striking and clearly talented in ways that had not yet found their proper outlet. Kelly noticed her immediately. What followed was the kind of courtship that happens when two people who are both intensely driven and not particularly patient decide they want to be together. Quick, certain, and conducted at the pace of people who do not see any reason to slow down. He was on the verge of Broadway stardom. She was 19 and had not yet decided exactly what she was going to become. What they recognized in each other, in those early months, was something simpler than any of that. A mutual seriousness, a shared unwillingness to be ordinary, a compatibility that felt real enough to build a life on. They married on September 26, 1941. She was 19. He was 28. The marriage began in New York, but relocated almost immediately to Los Angeles as Kelly's film career accelerated. They moved into a house in Beverly Hills that would become, across the following decade, one of the gathering points for a particular kind of Hollywood intellectual social life. Writers, directors, actors, and political thinkers who were drawn to Kelly's specific combination of working-class roots, genuine artistic seriousness, and strong progressive political convictions. Kelly was not simply a dancer who happened to be famous. He was someone with genuine intellectual interests, in art, in film theory, in politics. He had strong opinions about what popular entertainment could and should be, about the relationship between art and audience, about the social responsibilities of public figures. His household reflected these interests. The dinner parties at the Kelly home in Beverly Hills were, by the accounts of people who attended them, genuinely lively. Conversations about politics and film and the state of the world that ran late into the night. Betsy Blair, as she grew into her 20s, developed her own serious artistic identity. She was building a film career, smaller roles initially, but she was working, and she was developing into an actress of genuine quality. Her politics were, if anything, further left than her husband's, and in the political climate of the late 1940s, that was a fact that would matter enormously. Their daughter, Kerry Kelly, was born on October 16th, 1942. She was the couple's only child, and by all accounts, Gene Kelly was a devoted and genuinely present father, something that is worth noting because it was not universal among men of his professional stature in that era, men whose careers consumed most of their waking hours and who left the business of child-rearing entirely to their wives. The professional partnership between Kelly and his most important collaborator, the director Stanley Donen, was also consolidating during these years. Together, they co-directed On the Town in 1949 and Singin' in the Rain in 1952, two of the finest American musicals ever made. Kelly was, by the early 1950s, at the absolute peak of his craft. Someone who was simultaneously the most important choreographer in Hollywood film, one of its most bankable stars, and a genuine creative force who was reshaping what film musicals could do. Between those two films came An American in Paris in 1951, directed by Vincente Minnelli and produced by Arthur Freed. The film won 6 Academy Awards, including Best Picture. The 17-minute ballet sequence that closes it, a sustained piece of dance storytelling set against backdrops inspired by French Impressionist painters, was unlike anything that had been attempted in a Hollywood musical before. It was Kelly's vision, fought for against studio executives who thought it was too long, too expensive, and too experimental for a mainstream audience. He was right, and they were wrong, and the sequence remains one of the most ambitious things he ever did. Singin' in the Rain, which followed the year after, is the film he is most associated with in the popular memory. Its title number, 3 minutes of Kelly dancing in a manufactured rainstorm, was shot in 3 days, with Kelly running a fever throughout. The decision to mix milk into the water in the tank to make it show up better on camera meant that he was dancing in a substance that soaked through his suit with a particular thoroughness. He did it anyway, as many times as it required, until it was right. It is the most famous thing he ever did, and he did it sick and cold, and with the entire weight of a major studio production resting on every take. This was the productive context of the marriage to Betsy Blair. But under the surface, things were considerably more complicated. The post-war years brought the Red Scare and the House Un-American Activities Committee to Hollywood, with a force that reorganized the entire social and professional landscape of the film industry. The blacklist, the practice of refusing to hire people suspected of communist sympathies or associations, destroyed careers, ended friendships, and placed enormous pressure on everyone who had ever held progressive political views or associated with people who had. Betsy Blair was investigated for her political associations. She was not blacklisted in the formal sense, but the pressure on her career was real, and the studios were not eager to employ her. Kelly used his standing, considerable by this point, to intervene on her behalf. When MGM was reluctant to cast her in Marty in 1955, Kelly went to Harry Cohn at Columbia Pictures and used his leverage to push for her. She got the part, delivered a performance that was widely praised, and was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress. That Kelly fought for his wife's career in this way says something genuinely decent about him. But it also captures something about the nature of their relationship by the mid-1950s, an asymmetry of professional power that had been present since the beginning and that the political climate had made more pronounced. She was the one whose career was threatened, and he was the one with enough standing to protect it. The dynamic of who needed protecting and who did the protecting is never an entirely comfortable one in a marriage, however generously it is managed. The marriage had been under strain for some time before the end arrived. What exactly caused the final deterioration is a matter that both parties handled with considerable privacy. Neither Kelly nor Blair were people who found the airing of personal grievances in public to be a natural or comfortable impulse. What is documented is that they separated and that the divorce was finalized in 1957. They had been married for 16 years. Kerry was 14. Betsy Blair went on to a distinguished career in European cinema after the marriage ended, working with some of the finest directors in France and Italy. She married again, Carol Rice, the British film director, and lived a life that was, by her own accounts, full and meaningful. She died in 2009. What Kelly felt about the end of the marriage, in private, he kept private. What people who knew him in the period immediately following the divorce observed was a man who threw himself into work with even greater intensity than before, which, given his baseline level of intensity, was saying something. The years after Betsy Blair would be quieter on the personal front for a while, but they would not stay quiet. And the next chapter of his life would be shaped not by a gradual courtship, but by something considerably more impulsive. The years between. The period between Kelly's first and second marriages, roughly 1957 to 1960, was not a period of withdrawal or diminished output. He continued to work, continued to direct, continued to be one of the most prominent figures in American entertainment. But Singin' in the Rain had been made in 1952, and the form of the movie musical it exemplified. The big, ambitious, studio-produced musical that required the kind of resources and creative infrastructure that MGM had once provided almost without thinking, was becoming harder to sustain as the studio system itself began to change. Television was eating into cinema audiences. The great integrated musicals that Kelly had helped create were becoming economically difficult to justify. He adapted, as he always had, by expanding his range, directing, television work, projects that were different from anything he had done before. He directed Tunnel of Love in 1958 and Gigot in 1962. He appeared in Les Girls in 1957, one of his last major film musicals. He was never idle, and he was never professionally lost in the way that some performers of his generation were during this period of transition. What the late 1950s also gave him was time in Europe. He spent extended periods in France, a country he had always loved and that had always loved him in return. The French cultural establishment took the movie musical seriously in ways that the American critical world often did not, and Kelly was admired there with an intensity that was genuinely sustaining during a period when the Hollywood landscape was changing around him in ways that were not entirely to his advantage. But he was also, in his mid to late 40s, a man who had spent 20 years of his adult life as part of a household and who found living alone considerably less congenial than his professional confidence might have suggested. He was social by nature. He needed the texture of domestic life around him, even when his work was consuming most of his attention. The woman who would become his second wife came into his life in circumstances that were, by comparison with the measured beginnings of his first marriage, considerably more spontaneous. What that spontaneity produced was a marriage that surprised almost everyone who knew him and that would not survive long, though the depth of his feeling for the person involved was, by all accounts, entirely genuine. Marriage 2. Jean Coyne. Jan Coyne was not a stranger to Gene Kelly when they married in 1960. She was, in fact, someone who had been part of his professional world for years. A dancer and dance assistant who had worked alongside him for much of the 1950s. Someone whose talent he respected and whose presence in the professional landscape of his career was long established. She had, moreover, previously been married to Stanley Donen, Kelly's closest collaborator, the man who had co-directed his two greatest films. The overlap of personal and professional worlds in this story was intricate even by Hollywood standards. Donen and Kelly had navigated the creative partnership with the full knowledge that they were working in each other's personal orbits, which added its own layer of complexity to a professional relationship that was already intense. Jan had been part of the dance community in Hollywood for years, a serious, skilled professional who was known and respected by the people who made the best musicals of the era. She was not famous in the way that the stars around her were famous, but she was genuinely accomplished, and the people who worked with her consistently spoke about her with warmth and regard. Their marriage, on August 6th, 1960, was relatively quiet. No large public ceremony, no elaborate production. Kelly was 47. Jan was 36. It was the marriage of two adults who knew each other well and who had decided, without particular fanfare, to make their partnership official. What neither of them knew at the time of the wedding, or if they knew they did not yet fully understand the implications, was that Jeanne was already ill. She had leukemia. The diagnosis came not long after the marriage, and what followed was a period defined by the particular kind of love that expresses itself primarily through presence, through simply being there, through organizing one's life around the needs of someone who is losing their health. They had two children together in rapid succession. Timothy was born in 1962 and Bridget in 1964. Both births happened during a period when Jeanne's health was deteriorating, and the experience of new parenthood layered over the reality of a serious illness created a household of extraordinary emotional complexity, joy and grief occupying the same rooms, sometimes at the same time. Kelly was, by all accounts, devoted to Jeanne in a way that went considerably beyond what duty or social expectation would have required. He reorganized his professional life to be present at home. He took on fewer projects, turned down opportunities that would have taken him away for extended periods, and oriented his daily existence around the family they were building together, even as the shadow over it grew darker. What this cost him professionally is difficult to measure precisely, but it is worth noting. He was in his late 40s and early 50s during this period, years that for many directors and choreographers represent a peak of creative authority and capability. He worked, and he continued to work well, but the sustained dedication to major projects that had characterized the first half of his career was, during the years of Jeanne's illness, necessarily curtailed. He chose his family over his career in a period when those two things could not coexist at full intensity simultaneously, and he made that choice without apparent regret. Jeanne Coyne Kelly died on May 10th, 1973. She was 48 years old. She and Jean had been married for 13 years. The death of a spouse from a long illness is a particular kind of grief. Not the shock of sudden loss, but something that has been approaching for years, something you have watched coming and done everything possible to slow until the moment arrives, and all the preparation turns out to have prepared you for nothing much at all. Kelly had two young children. Timothy was 11, Bridget was 9. He was 60 years old. He had been, by this point, through a 16-year marriage and a 13-year marriage, had experienced the particular kinds of loss each brought with it, and was now a widower raising two children alone. He did not collapse. He was not, constitutionally, a person who collapsed. He kept working. He kept being present for his children. He kept dancing, in the limited ways that aging allows, and teaching, and directing, and being the person that his professional reputation required him to be in public contexts. But the people who knew him in the years after Jan's death described someone who was quieter than he had been, not broken, but changed in the way that cumulative loss changes people, permanently and without fanfare. The fire was still there, the intelligence, the drive, the opinions. But something had gone out that had been lit by the specific warmth of having a family around him. And the house in Beverly Hills was a different kind of place without Jan in it. He would be a widower for more than 10 years before he married again. What happened in those years? How he raised his children, how he kept working, how he processed what he had been through, is a chapter of his life that does not appear in many accounts because it was not dramatically eventful in the way that Hollywood stories are supposed to be. It was simply a man living with his losses and doing his best. And then, in his 70s, he fell in love one more time. Marriage. 3. Patricia Ward. Patricia Ward was 31 years old when she married Gene Kelly on August 15, 1990. He was 77. The age difference, 46 years, was the subject of considerable comment when the marriage became public. People who wrote about it did not always write about it kindly. The coverage had a tone that ranged from skeptical to outright dismissive, the assumption being that what was happening between an elderly legend and a much younger woman could not possibly be what it appeared to be. Those who knew them disagreed, often pointedly. She was a researcher and writer, not a performer, not someone whose own career existed in the same universe as Kelly's. She had met him in the mid-1980s, during a period when Kelly was doing the kind of work that older entertainers do: retrospectives, interviews, appearances at events honoring his career and the era it represented. She was present in a professional capacity initially, working with him on documentation of his life and work. And the relationship that developed from that beginning was gradual and, by the accounts of people who observed it closely, entirely genuine. Kelly had not been looking for a third marriage. He had raised his 2 children largely on his own through the 1970s and into the 1980s. He had not been without companionship during those years. He was Gene Kelly, and the suggestion that he spent 2 decades in complete solitude would not be accurate. But he had not married, had not seemed to be in any particular hurry to marry, and was, by the time he met Patricia Ward, someone who had organized his life into a workable shape that did not obviously require transformation. What Patricia Ward brought to that life, by the accounts of people who knew them together, was genuine. She was attentive to him in ways that mattered, not as a caretaker, not in the manner of someone performing a role, but as a partner who was genuinely interested in who he was, beyond the famous person. She was younger enough to have grown up watching him, to have known him first as the man on the screen rather than as a peer. And there was something in that, both complicated and simple, about what she brought to the relationship. His children's reactions to the marriage were mixed in the way that adult children's reactions to a surviving parent's remarriage are usually mixed. Kerry, his daughter from his first marriage, was in her late 40s by the time of the wedding. Timothy and Bridget, the children from his marriage to Jan Coyne, were 27 and 25 respectively. They had grown up watching their father grieve their mother. The arrival of a new person in a spousal role, decades after that grief, is not a simple thing to accommodate, even when it is clearly making the parent in question happy. And Kelly was, by the accounts of those who saw him in the early years of the marriage to Patricia Ward, happy in ways he had not been for some time. He was still working, consulting on productions, giving interviews, being Gene Kelly in the way that the entertainment industry periodically requires its legends to be Gene Kelly. But he was also, more consistently than before, simply at home, present, at ease in a household that had warmth in it again. He had his first stroke in 1994. He recovered, but the recovery was not complete, and the experience of a body that had been, throughout his entire life, one of his primary instruments beginning to fail him in serious ways, was something he found deeply difficult. He had always been physical, had defined himself through physical precision, through the extraordinary things his body could do when he asked it to. The loss of that precision, gradual and then more sudden after 1994, was not an abstract diminishment. It was the removal of something central to his identity. Kelly had, in the decades following his major film work, continued to speak publicly about dance, about what it was, what it required, what it could communicate. He gave lectures. He participated in documentaries. He was articulate about his craft in the way that not all great performers are, able to describe from the inside what the movement felt like and what he was trying to achieve with it. Losing the ability to demonstrate, to simply stand up and show what he meant, was, for him, a particular kind of loss that went beyond the physical. Patricia Ward Kelly was with him through all of this. She managed his care, his affairs, his public presence, the things that needed managing for someone whose mind was still largely present, but whose body was increasingly unreliable. People who observed her in this role described someone doing it without resentment, without performance, and without any of the complicated motivations that the cynical reading of a 46-year age gap might suggest. Gene Kelly suffered a second stroke in 1996, from which he did not recover. He died on February 2nd, 1996, at his home in Beverly Hills. He was 83 years old. Patricia Ward Kelly was 42. She stayed. After his death, she became the primary guardian of his legacy, managing his estate, his archive, his image. She has spoken about him in interviews over the years with a specificity and a warmth that are hard to dismiss as performance. She has described what their life together was actually like, the ordinary daily texture of it, in terms that suggest she knew him better than most people who wrote about him ever did. What 3 marriages look like from the outside. Looking at Gene Kelly's 3 marriages from a distance, what you see is 3 very different kinds of love at 3 very different stages of a life. The marriage to Betsy Blair was the marriage of 2 young, driven, politically serious people who grew up and grew apart in the particular furnace of post-war Hollywood. It lasted 16 years and produced a daughter and a body of shared experience that both of them carried for the rest of their lives. It ended, as many long marriages end, not with a single dramatic rupture, but with the accumulated weight of difference, in need, in direction, in what each of them had become. The political pressures of the Red Scare era were real forces in their lives and in their household, and the way those pressures played out, with Kelly's career shielded and Blair's threatened, shaped the dynamic between them in ways that were not always easy to navigate. The marriage to Jan Coyne was the marriage of a man in his late 40s and a woman in her mid-30s who had chosen each other with the full knowledge of who the other person was, and who then had the terrible luck to have illness arrive so close to the beginning. What Kelly gave to that marriage, the devotion, the reorganized professional life, the presence through 13 years of declining health, and then the solo parenting of 2 young children after Jean's death, is the part of his story that tends to get the least attention, because it does not have the glamour of the dance numbers or the drama of the political years. It is simply a man taking care of the people he loved. It is not nothing. It is, in fact, the hardest thing. The marriage to Patricia Ward was the marriage that people wrote about in the easiest, most dismissive terms. The old man and the young woman, the legend and the researcher, the obvious imbalance of age and fame. What those accounts miss, almost universally, is the quality of what was actually there. 2 people who found in each other something they had not found elsewhere. A household that was, by the testimony of those who knew it, warm and real and sustaining for both of them. Gene Kelly was not a simple person. The public image, the grin, the athleticism, the infectious on-screen joy was real, but it was also a surface. Underneath it was someone who had grown up poor in Pittsburgh, who had worked relentlessly to build something extraordinary from nothing, who held his feelings with considerable tightness in private while giving everything in performance. He was, by the accounts of his collaborators, demanding to work with. Not cruel, but exacting in the way that people are when their standards are very high, and they cannot quite lower them even when it would be easier for everyone. He was also someone who kept trying, in each marriage, to build the same thing: a home, in the fullest sense, a place where the performance could stop, a life that was not only about the work, however magnificent the work was. He found it, imperfectly and at cost, in each of the three, and the losses embedded in each: the long dissolution of the first, the slow grief of the second, the strokes and the diminishment of the third, were all losses that he absorbed and kept moving through, because that was what he had always done. He had been absorbing opposition and difficulty and the judgment of people who underestimated him since he was 8 years old in a Pittsburgh dance school, being laughed at for something he loved. He kept going. He kept dancing for as long as his body would let him. He kept making things, kept directing, kept being present in the rooms where the work happened. And then he stopped, on a February morning in 1996, in the house in Beverly Hills, where so much of his life had been lived, with his third wife beside him. What remains? Gene Kelly died, having made some of the most joyful films in the history of American cinema: Singin' in the Rain, An American in Paris, On the Town, Anchors Away. These are not films that merely entertain. They are arguments, made in movement, for the idea that human beings are capable of beauty on a scale that exceeds what ordinary life typically allows. He did not have an easy life. The three marriages each carried their own difficulty: the political pressures that shadowed the first, the illness that ran through the second like a thread of darkness, the age difference and health decline that defined the third. He was not always an easy person to be close to. He asked a great deal of the people in his orbit because he asked a great deal of himself, and the two things are not easy to separate. People who worked with him in the choreography room described someone who would run a sequence until it was right, regardless of how many times that required, who had a precise internal image of what he was after, and would not accept anything short of it. The same quality that made his work great made ordinary daily life with him, at times, demanding. What Kelly understood, and what his best work embodies, is that the relationship between difficulty and beauty is not always oppositional. Sometimes the difficulty is what makes the beauty possible. Not because suffering is instructive in some pat, fortune cookie sense, but because the people who have absorbed the most have sometimes the most to give when the camera rolls or the spotlight finds them. The rain sequence in Singin' in the Rain was shot over 3 days in 1951. The tank was cold. The suit was soaked. The fever was real. He danced it anyway, with a precision and a joy that 7 decades later makes people smile before they know they are smiling. That is the thing about Gene Kelly that no account of his personal difficulties fully cancels. Whatever was hard, and plenty was hard, he made the dancing look like the easiest, most natural thing in the world. He made it look like the only possible response to being alive. The boy from Pittsburgh, who had been mocked for taking dance lessons, became the man who redefined what the American movie musical could do. The 3 marriages, the losses within them, the years alone between the second and the third, none of it showed up in the dancing. Or rather, all of it showed up in the dancing. in the way that everything a person has lived shows up eventually in the thing they do best, transformed by the act of doing it into something that an audience receives as pure, unmediated feeling. For a man who experienced the losses he experienced and carried them the way he carried them, that was not nothing. It was, in fact, everything. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.